Weeds and their management are an important component of any green space management. Weeds on roadsides can be particularly problematic because the growing environment is already difficult for the plants we do want to grow there. This module will cover some basic weed biology, ecology, and control information to assist turfgrass professionals. A given plant species is not always a weed to everyone. People's preference for aesthetics or how a plant functions changes over time. What is considered a weed may change over time as well. Simply put, a weed is a plant out of place that has an undesirable effect. Weeds change how we maintain our intended green space. They become undesirable because they compete for resources with plants we want, making the desirable plants less competitive. Weeds may have differing growth characteristics compared to our desired plants and thus may affect how we maintain them. In some cases, weeds may grow faster than our preferred turf species, resulting in a higher mowing requirement. Finally, weeds may also attract pests or unwanted animals that may pose a risk to turf or drivers along a road. To better understand how weeds are a problem and how we can go about controlling them, we must first understand why they can be a problem in the first place. The most common way that weeds infiltrate a turf stand is through poor establishment of the turf stand. The best defense against weeds is a dense, healthy turf stand. In many cases, weeds are better adapted for a given environment than the turf we are trying to grow. Environmental conditions such as poor soils at the site can be difficult to control, but still be a limiting factor for turf growth. Similarly, we want to ensure that the turfgrass species or cultivar we are using is well adapted to the location and as competitive as possible. Finally, stresses from compaction, wear, traffic, or other turf pests such as disease or insects may weaken the turf to a point that creates voids for weeds to move into. Now that we understand why weeds can become problematic, we can discuss how to control them. First, we need to understand some basic things about their biology. Weeds are often classified by their life cycles and separated into three categories: annuals, biennials, and perennials. Annuals are plants that complete their life cycle from seed in 1 year. Specifically, annuals can be further divided into how they complete their life cycles in that year. Summer annuals, as the name suggests, do most of their growing and reproducing in the summer months. Summer annuals germinate as seed in the spring, grow, mature, and develop in the summer, and set seed and die in the fall or winter. A common example of a summer annual is crabgrass. Winter annuals germinate from seed in the fall, grow and develop between the fall and spring, when they set seed and die. A common example of a winter annual is annual bluegrass. Biennials are less common compared to annuals and perennials. They are plants that complete their life cycle in more than 1 year, but not more than 2 years. A common example of a biennial is musk thistle. Perennials are plants that live for more than 2 years. Some perennials will have the characteristic growth and development of an annual, but will not die upon reproducing via seed. These are called simple perennials. A common example of a simple perennial is dandelion. Other perennials may use creeping stems such as tillers, rhizomes, or stolons to reproduce and spread in addition to reproducing via seed. A common example of a creeping perennial is ground ivy or creeping Charlie. Understanding a weed's biology is essential for ensuring its control and prevention. We will discuss specific reasons why in the next slide. For example, control may not be necessary for a weed near the end of its life cycle. If you discover a summer annual weed infestation late in the summer, the weeds may be too difficult to control because they are too mature. Additionally, if you know that the weeds are near the end of their life cycle, it may be more efficient to spend resources on preparing the turf stand to prevent weeds from coming up the next year. Also, if you know of an annual infestation, you can use this information to predict when and where weeds occur for preventative maintenance practices before the next invasion takes place. Most plants that spread by creeping stems are perennials. Consequently, these plants will require more subsequent herbicide applications to control, as their stems provide carbohydrates and points of regrowth as the weeds recover from the herbicide application. Later in this weed control module, you will be using a weed ID tool to identify an unknown weed species. For now, understand that weeds are often classified based on how they appear, as either being grassy or grass-like, or as broadleaves. Annual bluegrass on the left is an example of a grassy weed, and broadleaf plantain on the right is an example of a broadleaf weed. Weed species are often an indication of an underlying cultural problem for a turf area. This is because these weeds are better adapted for that site's particular conditions. Some examples of cultural problems include excessive moisture, soil compaction, dry soil, high or infrequent mowing, and low nitrogen fertility levels. If the conditions that allow the indicator weed species to persist are not fixed, weeds will be a continuous problem. Thus, you must fix the underlying problem for why the weed is there, otherwise completely removing every weed from an area will be a wasted effort as the weeds will likely return. Here is a table for common conditions in the weed species that indicate them. Roadsides are a unique growing environment and often have one or more of these stresses. Some of these conditions include, but are not limited to, acidic or low pH soils, alkaline or high pH soils, compacted soils, dry soil conditions, flooded soils, high or infrequent mowing, low fertility, and poorly drained soils. Take a minute or two to review common stress conditions and the weeds often found in those areas. Prostrate knotweed is a weed that is commonly found in compacted soils. You may recall seeing knotweed adjacent to sidewalks or roadways where soil compaction from foot or vehicle traffic stress allowed knotweed to be more competitive than the turf that was originally planted. Now that we have a basic understanding of weeds and the reason why they exist, let's work through the steps to control them. We will cover each of these steps in more detail in the following slides. The most important step is determining which species you have at the site. Keep in mind you will very likely have multiple turf species. This will be important because we first must identify what it is we want before determining what is or is not a weed. Similarly, knowing the area or size of turf stand will be important for ultimately determining management options. Next, we must correctly identify the weed species. This will include understanding its life cycle, biology, and growth. After we identify each of the weed species at a given location, we need to think about why the weed is there. Is the turf stressed? Are the weed species present an indication of another underlying problem? Now that we understand some of the root causes for the weeds to be present, we will work to make the turf as competitive as possible. Remember, a dense, healthy turf is the best defense against weeds. This ends part 1 of this presentation. Continue to part 2 to continue watching.